I'm Michael James, and I'm welcoming you to another edition of the Live from the Heartland show. This is for the week of July 15th. It is number 161 since the beginnings of the pandemic. And we have a really nice lineup for this week's show. We've got Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz, a noted historian, and we have Adam James, who played football at Northwestern, really loves the team, but also understands the crisis that Northwestern is in. And he's going to talk to us a little bit about that. I'd like to share a couple of things. I got to go to Thalia Hall this week and see a new band. My son, Katie and Lake, who used to be in Twin Peaks, has a band called Lake. He had some notable musicians playing with him. It was a really nice show. It was good to be out and seeing live music. On the bad news front, Israel has not only invaded Jenin and killed a number of people and destroyed 80% of the homes in the camp. They also are once again trying to jury rig the Constitution and make it harder for the Supreme Court to oppose some of the right-wing decisions being made in that country. More on that to come. On the Supreme Court, pretty terrible. We are waiting possibly another really negative decision, the rights of domestic abusers to have guns. On the labor front, UPS looks like they might be going out on strike. And my union, the Screen Actors Guild, SAG-AFTRA, went out on strike. Hopefully that'll end soon, but if not, we'll be walking a picket line with others, and you'll have to get your entertainment some other way than some new movie. All right. I do have one thing I would like to share that I found very interesting. It is a PBS show, which you can get on YouTube if you go to PBS or to their site. The Memorial Day Massacre. Workers die. The film is buried. They showed this in May, and it's about the events in Chicago in 1937 when the police opened fire on striking steelworkers and their supporters in an open field, killing 10. Nearly all shot in the back as they fled. Press accounts generally accepted the police story. It's not unlike when Fred Hampton was killed, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of times the press will take whatever they're told without checking it out. In this case, there were unionists attacked, and they were accused of rioting. A cameraman for a leading newsreel, Paramount News, was at the scene. He captured the truth of the film. Paramount then suppressed it. Newsreel devoted to the incident for years. It's out now, and it's really something to see. It's really kind of interesting because we are in a time of renewed interest in unions and growth in unions going on at the same time where we have this rise of the right wing. So you're in a union, congratulations. If you're not in a union, you may want to help organize one. Onward. Sorry to hear that the New York Times has given up their sports section. It always tried to make it interesting for everybody, not just fans. And another thing on the sports front, Adam James, my cousin, who played football at Northwestern and is in film and martial arts things these days, he'll be on this show talking a little bit about Northwestern and all the hullabaloo around the firing of their coach. In memoriam, Gene Arbetter, longtime body worker, all-around wonderful person, has passed. Our hearts go out to Martha Howard and the whole family. And a real interesting thing in our ward here in the 49th Ward, Clark Devon Hardware. I've been there, over the last 50 years, over and over and over and over. They're selling the business. And a lot of big outfits wanted to buy it, but they're selling it to the employees. So as we get more news on that and how that all came down and will proceed, I think it's wonderful. So with all that said, I think we're going to take a short musical break. We're going to be right back with our first guest for today. That would be Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz. We're going to talk about colonial settlers. We're going to talk about immigration. We're going to talk about white supremacy. We're going to talk about the NRA and the right wing. We're going to talk about a whole lot of things. So stay tuned to Live from the Heartland show for the week of July 15th. Well, we're back for more Live from the Heartland. This is the show for the 15th of July. It is number 160 since the beginning of the pandemic. And I'm really honored to bring on one of America's greatest historians, the one, the only Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz. Good afternoon to you, Roxanne.
Good afternoon, Michael. Good to
Good,
be with you
it's
again.
good to have you. I know we've been chasing this for a while, and I know you're feeling a little bit better. Um, and I got to look at a lot of stuff that you've written or read about them. I confess the only book I think I read was Growing Up Okie or Red Dirt, Oklahoma. Um,
hmm
which is, Oklahoma has always fascinated me. So I think maybe while I've got you on this Zoom for Live from the Heartland, we could talk a little bit about your books in general, do a little bit of stuff about Oklahoma. We'll talk some immigration, some indigenous rights and people's movements, etc. I think we'll have a good time, and everyone who's either listening or watching, depending on how you get the show, you're going to have a good time. So, with all that said, how are you doing?
Yeah, well, I'm doing fine. Yeah, let's start with Oklahoma. I am a historian, I have a doctorate in history from UCLA, and I wrote my dissertation on the history of land tenure in New Mexico. And I was doing Latin American history. So that used to be, a Spanish colony. And so most of the book is about the Spanish period. I add on the US period. But then I got recruited by it was a year after the American Indian movement of Wounded Knee. And so the trials of all the leaders had taken place, and I sort of followed it. I didn't have a television, so I followed it a little bit, but I wasn't in any way involved. And then I got recruited by. I actually was in touch with a lawyer who had been Angela Davis's lawyer and was also working with the Wounded Knee, a legal defense, John Thorne, a white, fantastic leftist lawyer in San Jose, California. And I knew John from way back. I can't even remember when we met, but he was a friend. And he called me up and he said, would you be willing to be an expert witness in the Wounded Knee trials? It's actually not a trial, but a an attempt to put all the cases together and dismiss them. So it was just a judge, not a jury or anything. And I said, well, what would I have to say? I don't know anything about it. And he said, well, you wrote this wonderful book, on New Mexico and the conquest of the Pueblo Indians and the Navajos. And I said, well, what does that have to do with South Dakota and AIM? I was kind of clueless, honestly. And he said, well, I wanted to, he put Vine Deloria on the phone, and I knew he was a famous author. I mean, I thought it was a famous author. And he said, I'm sure you, from what John tells me, you're a fast learner. And, and so they sent me this box of documents to read and to prepare to be an expert witness. So anyway, that led to me going and actually being on the team, not just giving expert testimony, but helping organize it and everything. Because I'm an older organizer, I mean, someone tells me, could you do this? Oh, yes, well, I'll do this. And I get a crew together and we do it. You know how? I mean, it's 60 people. We're great organizers. And so then I kind of got drafted into being an organizer for Native rights and changed my whole field from Latin American history to helping set up ethnic studies programs and Native American studies, and ended up at Cal State Hayward. So that's my academic career and movement, before and after I got a PhD. sort of put together. And I started, I wrote that. That was my first book, my dissertation. I published it, but then I published the hearings at that Wounded Knee thing, and was in Nebraska in federal court, and published that as the Great Sioux Nation, and all of the money from it. It sold very well. Books used to sell very well, and it all went to the International Indian Treaty Council. So then I got involved, kind of drafted in being involved in the UN work, and this is how I got then a decade or two decades really of helping build the Indigenous Caucus in the United Nations, which is now just huge. It's like just it's the biggest mass non-governmental organization meeting in the UN system every year. And so I'm retired. I retired from doing that myself about 10 years ago. But so that was a very exciting time. But I didn't get much time to write during that time. I did one book in 1983, and I thought I have just got to get back to writing. Because I was writing a lot, but it was mostly, well, let's be frank, propaganda. I mean, it wasn't analysis so much as UN reports and articles and stuff. And I want to get back to being a historian. So but then I decided I had to really learn to write in a different way than I was trained, as a historian, just, facts and indexes and footnotes and highly researched. I knew how to do that, and I wanted to continue doing that. But I want to write in because I had written a lot, and I actually had wanted to be an English major and a writer and turn to history. So I started doing writing groups and all that to lead up to why did I write an autobiography about growing up in Oklahoma. That's how I got there, because that's what I tackled, with I spent a lot of time in Nicaragua in the 1980s, exposing the Contra War and reporting to the UN. So I wanted to write about that. And I knew I could tell the history, but I wanted it to be in a form that would be more journalistic or literary. So I joined a bunch of writing groups. I went to a month-long writing workshop at Bennington, and I did. I learned to write in this literary way, and so then I wrote Red Dirt, Growing Up Okie. I kept, when I was trying to write about Nicaragua, I kept wanting to tell the backstory of me and how I got there. And I finally just gave over to it and wrote about the first 20 years of my life in Oklahoma. And
I loved the Oklahoma book, and I always had a kind of infatuation with Oklahoma, thinking it was kind of a cool place, and I'm always curious about Oklahoma because, I think you talk about it in your book, that first book on Oklahoma. You talked about the Green Corn Rebellion, which was in 1917 against conscription, and it was Native Americans, Muskogee Creek, and then European Americans, farmers, Mexican Americans, and African Americans. So for me, it was always, and I remember telling this to Cornell West when I introduced him at the Heartland Cafe, and he loved it because he's from Oklahoma. And I'm always a little puzzled about Oklahoma because there's a lot of Native Americans there, and there's a lot of African Americans there. And yet it has, after the early days when we had the Green Corn Rebellion, your father was a socialist and an atheist. I think it was even before oil. It just people in the green corn got wiped out. And,
Yeah.
it's been very right wing. I know in the news just now, the last three remaining people from the massacre in 1921 in Tulsa, the judge threw it out, wouldn't proceed,
I
Uh,
know.
and I'm always so sorry that Oklahoma, even though it has lots of marijuana now, is such a right wing place. And I don't know if there's that much hope for it. Um,
Yeah.
Roxanne, you did mention Nicaragua. That I didn't know, but you had a book out, I think, on them. What's the group? Mosquito Indians on the East Coast.
Yes, it's called Blood on the Border, a memoir of the Contra War. All of the revolutionaries, the Sandino revolutionaries, fled. And so San Francisco, the whole Latino population was Nicaraguan and some Salvadorans. So they all went down to fight in the revolution. And they were leaders of our movements here. And suddenly there's this gap. You could really tell at the same time the Iranians, who were also militant, they went to the Iran. I mean, we look around, where's our movements? Where are our demonstrations? They've gone to fight at home.
I don't know where Nicaragua is at today. I mean, you talk about San Francisco. When I went to Nicaragua the first time, Berto Vargas was our contact, and he talked to me about when they would be practicing up in the hills outside of San Francisco.
I know
the revolution.
Absolutely, and we were friends, back then, and I knew them because I was at San Francisco State, and there were a lot of Nicaraguans there, and so yeah, the movement was really strong here, and then they all went back home, and of course that Roberto organized a trip for us to take a trade unionist. He had worked with trade unionists. He was an organizer for trade unionists, organized with the United Farm Workers and then other, trade unions. And the trade union movement was really getting organized. And I mean, it was a part of the revolution, that brought the Sandinistas to power. It's lesser known, but he organized several of us who were in unions. And of course, I was active in my teachers' union at Cal State Hayward. And so he invited me and several others, from the telephone company and from the longshoremen, 3 longshoremen, black longshoremen. It was a wonderful delegation. I mean, everyone was so impressed because some of the delegations going down were pretty lightweight. I mean, it was like, okay.
We were playing baseball.
Yeah, but we were, yeah, all the workers, we went into, there weren't that many factories, and, it's an agricultural country. But every factory that did exist, we visited it. And of course, the longshoremen at the the piers on both sides, on the Gulf and on the Pacific, we met. So it was just a really, it wasn't a high up, we didn't meet Daniel Ortega or really anyone. We were just traveling around Western Nicaragua. And then Roberto asked me to stay instead of going back, so he could arrange for me to go out to the eastern part of the country and just give my opinion of what was going on, because we knew that the CIA was organizing to overthrow the Sandinistas, of course. That was known when they overthrew Grenada, that was like the rehearsal, in 1983. Yeah. And so I said, yes, I could do that. Well, I had no idea what I was getting into, even in Oklahoma with all, I never saw a paved road growing up. I grew up rural. But this was beyond rural. This was desolation. It was really the only instrument for the farmers was a machete. No tractors, nothing. So I felt quite at home in some ways, you know. I mean, I felt at ease with these people. They farmers are kind of have something in common around the world. Not big wheat farmers, but you know, real farmers that put their hands in the dirt. And so we went, and it was already they had decided to organize. They had a plan. I found out from Phil Agee and some of these other CIA guys who had turned against the CIA, how they planned things. And they were using the Hmong plan, you know, how they recruited the Hmongs to be a force to fight the Vietnamese. They trained the these mosquitoes. They chose the mosquitoes as the Hmong, you know, the Hmong blueprint. And so I didn't know that, you know, I didn't know that when I went there. But I started seeing things that, you know, were clearly what I did know about the CIA, and I was certainly no expert on the CIA. I had read James Agee's book, his memoir, and knew, you know, kind of what their practices were. And they were training in camps. So I started, I spent 6 weeks out there. You know, he kind of dropped me there and left me, and then there's no way to get back.
We have a limited amount of time, so I'm going to switch gears here because there's two things that I've heard you talking about, and I know you've written about. And first would be, I know this is a lot to cram in, but kind of the mythology of us being an immigrant nation and how we have viewed immigration. A little bit about settler colonialism.
Yeah.
And the myth of the nation of immigrants.
Yeah, that's my 2021 book, Not a Nation of Immigrants, on settler colonialism. Yeah, that's something that really bothered me for a long time, you know, that slogan, which when I started researching it, I didn't really know the source of it. I just thought maybe that's what was always said, you know, back from the beginning. But no, it was John F. Kennedy wrote a book called A Nation of Immigrants. And this is a bestseller. I don't know why I didn't remember it, because I loved John F. Kennedy. You know, it was
for a while.
For a while, yeah. But back in the day, you know, I don't know why I didn't read that little book, but I didn't. So I had no idea that it was him. And then it took on, you know, it got promoted as kind of the slogan for the United States, that it's a nation of immigrants. And because I had already done a lot of work on settler colonialism, and it was very clear the United States was a settler colonial country, and you know, all you have to do is be in any kind of relationship, as I was, you know, with the Sioux trials and all the Wounded Knee trials, to know that settler colonialism was, you know, the United States created the blueprint for that. And so that, that was, that book was really interesting to research because there's so much I didn't know. You know, I love it. You know, historians, I think, love this when they set out to write something and they think they're the expert, and then they discover you keep finding these jewels, you know, these things, and you learn from yourself. You know, it's the most exciting thing about being a historian. People think, well, you knew all that all the time. No, I learned it while writing this book, you know, that it was just so interesting. And so that nation of immigrants is a kind of cover up for settler colonialism and genocide. It's why Native American history wasn't taught for years and still isn't extensively taught, you know, only in liberal urban centers, I would say, and probably in the South. There's very little. And back east, they just think, well, you know, they never had any Indians there anyway. So It was all a Western story. It didn't start at the Atlantic Ocean and go to the West, but after, a genocide, ethnic cleansing. So yeah, by that time there were a couple of really, really good books that had come out on settler colonialism in Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and the United Anglo settler colonialism. And it really started in Ireland, with the British settler colonialism of what Northern Ireland is today. So it was just such an interesting book to write because tracing it back and then having a whole chapter on Ireland and a whole chapter, well, beginning with Spain, that was in places they had settler colonialism, like New Mexico and later Argentina, Chile, and Paraguay. So, yeah, it's really important to understand. This means that people who settled consider themselves indigenous, because they actually, the army goes in and does the killing mostly, but then it's free land, to take. So they see themselves as indigenous to the land. And it's such a screwed up thing, that's how you have the right-wing Republican Party today. There's always been that strand, but it's been more isolated. It used to just be the norm.
Yeah, we have this, this myth of a nation of people from all over, and we're all coming together and making a beautiful thing. And I definitely grew up with that kind of melting pot notion and believed it.
I do too.
I've just been reading a book by a woman named Kelly Little Hernandez called Bad Mexicans.
Yes.
About the Mogonistas on the border, building up to the Mexican Revolution. And she talks about in this book, and I bring this up because there's so much resistance to immigrants throughout our whole history, and it currently is going on now. She talked about 1915, El Plan de San Diego. And it was basically Mexicans on the border finally being tired of being lynched and beaten up and robbed, and they fought back, and a few people were killed, and that resulted in a thing called the Matanza, with the massacre, and they killed like at least 300 Mexicans. And this is not, I think this will come out more as Latinos become, more ingrained in the society, and the history of the repression is shared. But all of this kind of leads to this whole underlying thing that we knew was there, kind of a fascist underbelly. And you talk a lot about, and you said you're working on white supremacy. And let's talk a little bit about the plague of white supremacy at a time when we are about to have more than 50% of the people in this country be non-white.
Yeah.
So what's happening?
And in a couple of decades, the demography will reduce the Anglo-white population. They include Germans and Scandinavians and all that,
I can't wait.
They'll be reduced in numbers. And so I think, the rise of white supremacy, again, it was, white supremacy was just the rule up to the 1953 Board of Education decision to integrate schools. Until then, there was, everything was locked down, and Black people started fleeing the South, in the turn of the century to get out of there and go north. But there they faced segregation too. And here in California, they face segregation. Here, we're doing a reparations thing here in San Francisco right now for the segregation and oppression. So, but it was all locked down, and here suddenly there's this. They're going to integrate schools, so it really starts in the South. Actually, Missouri, the White Citizens Council forms, the John Birch Society. I'm writing a book now, a book of essays on white nationalism. So I've I did the chapter on that, especially on the John Birch Society and how insidious they were. They still exist, but actually, it's just the Republican Party now.
I realized John Birch was a big thing. I remember in the early 60s, it was,
Yeah.
I was real aware of it. And there were I went to Lake Forest College and there were some conservative Republicans there. And that's when I first learned about the John Birch Society. But what do you think the chances are of white supremacy actually conquering the rest of us? Or do you think that this will fade out over time?
Well, I think the Democratic Party they're kind of in denial about the seriousness of this. And myself, coming from rural Oklahoma, some of these people are my relatives. I mean, I don't feel like it is something that will just disappear. That just because they're a minority doesn't. It's always minorities that have started revolutions. This is a counter revolution, but it's scary. I mean, it was hoisted to power, presidential power, with what's his name, Donald Trump.
You don't have to use his name. We know who you're talking about.
And it's terrifying. And they seem just like everyone is rational. Let's just be rational here, and win elections. And why aren't we winning elections when we're the majority? Because they've taken power in the states, in the counties. They started out the John Birch Society back in 1956, Orange County. That's the only place they were, a tiny group, And now it's the whole Republican Party. And you could see it with Nixon. You could see it with, he was a California boy and came out of Orange County. So it's not like it's just popped up now. It's a whole process. But they're in such denial that I'm really scared that just not enough is being done to expose them. They're not the Republican Party is no longer a really legitimate party. It's gerrymandered. They seem to be smarter about power. Democrats
and a lot of money to put into things too.
But Democrats have always depended on the vote, but and that's fine. But when you have district representation and you've taken over districts and gerrymandering them, they can always find a way to win. And so that it's a very scary time, I think, that we are really just because they're a minority, but they do have a hardcore base of 20 million people. Now, what if we on the left had a total Marxian 20 million people in the United States? Imagine what we could do.
Yeah, that's great.
That's what they're doing.
I got two more questions I want to try to get in. One would be, you did a book on guns. I think on the Second Amendment.
Yes.
What I got here is Loaded: A Disarming History of the Second Amendment. And I know that I heard you talk about how right-wing groups have basically taken over the NRA. So could you give us, our viewers and listeners, a few minutes on guns and the Second Amendment and the status of the NRA?
Yeah, the NRA is interesting. It was formed in the 1880s by former Union soldiers to teach marksmanship because that had become a sport in the Olympics, and to send, just use BB guns, for marksmanship. Blanks, it's not really gunslinging kind of sport. So that it stayed pretty benign. In the 1930s, there was the first gun law was passed, there were local gun laws, and most of them were restrictive. Leave your guns at the door, at the door in the saloon. Or take them in with you.
I've seen
All
those
that.
signs back in the day. Now I see
Yeah,
signs that say no guns at all, but I remember in Montana, leave your gun at the door.
right, exactly. Yeah. So that the NRA was pretty much, when they testified before Congress about the outlawing the what used to be called the Tommy gun, the first kind of militaristic repeating rifle, they supported it. They said, would this go against NRA? The question, they said, no, we support it. So that's the only gun law, and they supported it. So when it changed was after Vietnam. It's a very important time, 1975. The bitterness of the soldiers, the beginning of the what they call it, that movement of veterans, about the bodies left in Vietnam.
In action, MIA.
Yeah. And this, in the beginning of, kind of armed groups and all. And so 75 was a really, I can remember it, a really fraught time, that there were just things kind of popping up that were so right wing. The NRA got taken over by a Harlan Carter, who had been a border guard, border chief. He was in charge of the expulsion of millions of Mexicans in the 1950s. And he went on to he had grown up in El Paso and, on the border. And basically, his dad was a border guard. He was a border guard. And then he retired from that, and he moved up to Washington State in the East, where there's always been a kind of right-wing thing there. There's a white, the white America. They want to have a white part of that would separate from the United States. So they had this little separatist group, and he went there and really got them organized. And then that group infiltrated the NRA and took over in 1975. White nationalists took over the NRA in 1975. White nationalists are in charge of it. It doesn't mean the membership, people don't know. The people who join, who are like hunters or whatever, and they want to be in an organization, it's not very expensive. They don't really have to do anything. They don't even have to go online and look at the crazy videos they have there. So 5,000 members, that most of them are benign, so that they took over. They have become more and more white nationalists. And so the NRA is really a organized fascist organization with a good percentage, probably about 10% of really hardcore fascists, white nationalists.
Roxanne, let me ask you, as we close out, I mean, we could talk for a long time, but you and I have both been in the movement for a long time. And I would like to ask you if you could share any thoughts you might have on advice to younger and newer activists about things to do and how to keep your sanity going forward.
Yeah, I was thinking of this, how we back then we had SDS, it's like shirts and ties, and women in skirts and very straight, and then the hippies came along and kind of culturally radicalized, and so and then the Vietnam War, the buildup of the Vietnam War. So all this kind of merged into huge protest movements. It's hard to remember now how big they were, and up until I remember the last really big one I know about was the 1983, the anti-nuke rally in New York that went, the marchers started at the bottom of Manhattan, and by the time those of us in mid Manhattan got in, they were already gone, and by the time we got to the park where there was then a rally, they were halfway through the rally. I mean, it was huge numbers, millions of people, and that was against, for nuclear disarmament. So I think our movements, that was kind of the end. It seemed like, oh, it's revived because we had all these, massive demonstrations. But when the Vietnam War ended, there really was, we had the women's movement, we had marches, women's marches, but nothing that, would be that really attract young people, and then the Reagan administration, it just put a pall on things. It really hurts my head to even remember the Reagan era because that was when I was the Contra War, and I was so involved, and we lost. I have the feeling that we lost big, and there's this kind of morose. We haven't been able to pull out of that, our generation. So we ignited new generations at first, and they carried on. They were fantastic in Central America in the 1980s. Younger people, they don't even need me anymore. This is fantastic. But then after the crash of really existing socialism, the USSR, the Soviet Union, and Eastern Europe, and China had already, kind of made its peace with Nixon, and then we really haven't been able to revive, even the Iraq War, that one huge demonstration, and then I remember young people, and that was mostly really young people, our grandchildren, and they had this, when it didn't stop the war, the war went ahead. They thought, well, demonstrations don't do any good, we lost. So we don't see that kind of we had in 2011, the rather strange camping in the town square.
We did have after when Trump was elected, I remember there were the women's marches all over the country.
Yeah, well, women's marches, yeah. But, these, I think that's been so specific that there really weren't women against war marches, which we had in the 60s and 70s, the fantastic women's for peace, and so we haven't combined these things. They're more specific marches, and we've had the teachers, and you remember, I mean, it's almost forgotten these teacher strikes all over the country a few years ago.
Yeah, we've had a bunch of them in Chicago. I'm running out of time here, and I'm really honored to have you talk to you, and I'm going to probably hit on you to do it again at some
Great.
point. I want to really thank you, Roxanne, for coming on. And you keep writing because what you're doing is really good, and I've sort of given up watching sports every night, and I'm starting to read more again, which is probably a good thing. So thanks an awful lot, and I'll be in touch.
Thank you, Michael.
Okay,
Bye.
We'll be right back with more Live from the Heartland. And now it's time for sports. And once again, I'm bringing on the actor, the producer, the writer, the martial artist, a former Northwestern University football player, and my cousin, Adam James. How you doing, cousin, out there in California?
I'm doing fantastic. How are you, Michael?
I'm doing good. We don't have a lot of time, but we have an important issue. It's right up the road from where I'm recording this right now. Northwestern University is involved in a little bit of a scandal. Tell us what you know, and then I'll ask you what you think about it and your own experience as a player. So what do you know about what's going on?
Well, first of all, what everybody out there should know, all of the Heartland fans, people from Chicago who love sports and appreciate Northwestern's academic standing and athletic achievements. There's been a tremendous success run with the football program under the leadership of a man named Pat Fitzgerald. Pat was a football player at Northwestern during the 1990s when a coach named Gary Barnett was leading the team. And they had a remarkable breakthrough. They made it to the Rose Bowl. Pat was named Defensive Player of the Year, Buckus Award winner, had a fantastic college career. He's in the Hall of Fame, College Football Hall of Fame. He took over as a very young coach. He was 31 years old at the time when Coach Walker passed away. And he did a great job. He's a great motivator, great recruiter. They've had a lot of success. They've won 2 Big Ten West titles, been to a bunch of bowl games. I think he's won 4 or 5 bowl games. Well, the news that broke over the last couple of days was that there was a incident of hazing. And what has been reported, it wasn't just an incident, it was a program, a system of hazing that was going on for years. And there was evidence that Coach may have known about it, but he certainly should have known about it. And he should have put a stop to it when it was going on. So unfortunately, as this news got out, the administration at Northwestern, the president and the leadership didn't handle it really well. They did an internal investigation. They kept the results private as they are a private institution. They were allowed to do that. But in today's media world, information gets out. And when they made the announcement that they did this thorough investigation, I'm not going to tell anybody what they found, but they are going to suspend the coach for 2 weeks during the summer when there's no games going on, no practices going on. It didn't sit well with some of the people that had reported it. And one guy in particular, who's remained anonymous as a whistleblower, he did step forward and he spoke with the Daily Northwestern, which is the local, it's the newspaper from the university students. And it was a very detailed report of horrific, completely inappropriate, and quite frankly, illegal activities that were going on with the football players. Again, coach should have known about it. If he was ignorant to it, shame on him for not being more aware. That's his job, to be heavily integrated. And furthermore, everybody who's been around any, masculine team, and quite frankly, it happens in women's sports and women's gatherings as well, police academies, military units, sports teams, it's basically organized bullying. That's what hazing is. And, everybody knows that it's somewhere, it's happening at some level. It's usually pretty microaggression kind of stuff. But in this case, it was really bad. And again, should have known about it. There's belief that some people felt that he did know about it and even condoned it. Anyway, the university, as they looked worse for only giving him a slap on the wrist, got aggressive and fired him. So unfortunately for the Northwestern University and certainly this sports program, it's a huge blow. He was an amazing coach. He is in many ways the greatest player and the greatest coach that's ever been at Northwestern. Well, maybe not over Otto Graham. But anyway, certainly a great, great guy. And it's going to be a huge blow to the university. We're going to take a step back. They're going to be under the leadership of the defensive coordinator, at least initially, that's the word. He'll lead the team, him and the offensive coordinator. The entire staff is being kept on. Many of the players, there's no changes there. Many of them can enter what's called the transfer portal. If they choose to, they have 30 days after a head coach change. None have done so far. It's going to be a tough season, but you never know. These guys, all the power to these young men. May they, rally around the new coaching team, new coaching staff, and find a way to unify and get through this and have a strong season.
Let me jump in here. You did mention to me, I think, in a conversation that he had played under Coach Gary Barnett.
Yes.
And Barnett was also involved in some kind of negative situation. You want to share a little of that?
Yes, well, Gary Barnett was a great coach. He'd been at the University of Colorado when they won the national championship. He came to Northwestern after Dennis Green and Francis Pay. Gary took over the program and did a tremendous job. He got them to the Rose Bowl. Then he got the job at Colorado. So he went to Colorado, was the coach there. They had a female kicker. You may have heard about that. She was harassed. She endured a lot, and she protested. And it was found that Barnett was, if nothing else, should have been aware, but may have been aware and allowed it to occur. Anyway, he was let go because of a harassing scandal. Now, when I played, and again, I played under Dennis Green and Francis Pay, and it was different. It was, that was 35, 40 years ago. But there was hazing. There was hazing going on then. And I wouldn't be surprised if, these things continue as they do in many programs, many gatherings of men, that they may have been continuing on when Pat Fitzgerald was there playing under Gary Barnett. I don't know. But we do know that Gary Barnett had hazing going on in Colorado. And we do know that Pat Fitzgerald had it going on at Northwestern. But regardless, I wish Pat Fitzgerald the best. It's unfortunate this is how his legacy at Northwestern will end, but I'm confident he'll go on and do other things. I hope that he can, come to grips with what occurred there and never allow that kind of thing to happen on his watch again.
But your position was he should be fired.
Absolutely. Once this became aware, there's no way any person whose own son was on that team and may have endured these kind of things would ever want that guy in charge of their children again. And that's going to be the tough thing for Pat. He's going to have to convince people that he, has that authority and that he has that responsibility.
I try to remember back. I played football at not a powerful school like Northwestern's team. I played at Lake Forest College, and I don't remember any stuff like that, to be honest with you. I do remember in high school playing high school football where people would take a stick and dip it into the analgesic balm and kind of come at you for your private parts and your rear end, that kind of thing. And it was just pretty common practice, stuff like that in the locker room.
And a lot of people, one of the things you'll hear in some circles, especially amongst tough guys, is these guys that were getting harassed, they should have just took it and moved forward. That's some of the attitude you'll hear some people say. Pat Fitzgerald should not have been fired. You'll hear some people say that, these kind of things go on. He should just been, slapped harder on the wrist. But truthfully, is if you are the recipient of that stuff, one of the things that goes through your mind is, I could fight back, but there's like 20 of them and one of me. The other thing that goes through your mind is, I want to be a part of this team. I want to play. I want to have respect of these guys. So a lot of times they'll just take it. And that's what people, when we're analyzing bullying, is that the victims oftentimes not only are the victim of bullying, but they're victim of society's attitudes towards people who get bullied, that you should be tougher, you should be able to take it. And quite honestly, that's not appropriate. We should be standing up for each other. And these guys that were in conducting these kind of things, they needed to remind themselves that they're like the big brothers. Their job is to create an environment where these younger players feel welcome, supported, that they can be their best, they can strive to be better than they are now. And it's hard to do that when you're looking over your shoulder for some guy coming up behind you with a hockey stick with analgesic balm on it.
Okay, Adam, this is good. I'm glad you shared that. And get another sports report ready for the next about a month away from now.
If I may, I'll finish with this last little note. Of course, the sport that I'm in now, and I have been for most of my life, is martial arts. And there's a really great event going on here in the Southern California area coming up on August 5th. It's called Dragon Fest. Dragon Fest is an expo trade show for martial arts enthusiasts. It is in support of the Martial Arts History Museum, which is located in Burbank, California. It's heavily tied to the martial arts movie industry as well. So Dragon Fest has all kinds of martial arts, experts there doing demonstrations, but there's also all kinds of movie stars showing up, doing autographs, photography stuff. It's a lot of fun. So for anybody out there who's in Southern California and loves martial arts, come on out to Dragon Fest on August 5th at the Glendale Civic Auditorium in support of the Martial Arts History Museum. And no matter where you are in the country, if you love martial arts, this one's worth jumping on a plane or getting in your car and driving out and saying hello and hanging out with us.
I want to just thank not only Adam James, but Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz. I want to thank our engineer, Hal James. I want to clue you all in that next week we've got Michael Deutsch from the People's Law Office and a woman named Grania Duffy from Ireland who's coming to town to play, and she'll be on. And in 2 weeks, we've got the great harmonica player Charlie Musselwhite. And that'll be a good one. So have a great week. Keep doing good in the world, because the world needs all the good that you do, that I do, that we all do together. All power to the people. Over and out.